Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Maribel Florez, Director of Global Learning here at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today as we celebrate South Africa Week, Descubrir Sudáfrica con la UC. Together with the South African Embassy in Chile, we've organized a variety of academic and cultural activities so that over the next few days, the entire UC community can get to know more about this country and explore topics of mutual interest without the need for travel. Today, it's an honor to introduce to you the distinguished philosopher, Mr. Mogobe Bernard Ramose. Dr. Ramose is a world-respected scholar and professor of jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He's one of South Africa's leading thinkers who's popularized African philosophy and specifically Ubuntu. Dr. Ramose, we're grateful to have you with us here today, as well as with the South African Embassy. As I turn the platform over to you, I'd invite our audience members to add their questions in the comments section on our YouTube channel. So that's it from me. I'm not sure if perhaps Dr. Ramose, if you're ready to begin, it would be a pleasure.
Good afternoon to you, Madam Florez. I believe you can hear me, am I right? Hello?
I can hear you, okay, yes.
Oh, good. And good afternoon to His Excellency and all the members of the South African Diplomatic Corps. I very much wish to convey my gratitude to you for having collaborated with the Pontifical University to make this occasion possible today. My gratitude to you all indeed. I wish to extend the same to everyone participating physically with you there and everyone else who is participating virtually. Welcome to you all, because I'm aware you could have chosen to do other things, but the fact that you are with us is something that needs to be deeply acknowledged and appreciated. So,
Professor Ramose, we're really interested in learning a little bit, if you could tell us about what is Ubuntu? How is it related with South Africa and Africa? And what does it mean when we call it an African philosophy?
We seem to have lost the audio.
Turn on your microphone. If you could please turn on your microphone and start again, that'd be wonderful. There you go. Now you can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, now you can hear me. All right. I said that you actually have started mentioning the word Africa, and this is what I would like. It looks like technology is playing games on me. Anyway, I hope now you can hear me. Am I correct? Can you hear me? Great. All right. Well, there is quite a problem with the word or the concept Africa. I will not go into details about it because of the strictures of time. But it is the case that this name, Africa, is actually a name that has been not only conferred upon the peoples of this continent, it has actually been imposed upon the peoples of this continent by those who have conquered the continent in definitely unjust wars. Now, because of that, it is quite a problem. It is an ethical and a legal problem to refer to the continent and its peoples as Africans, precisely because they did not give this name to themselves voluntarily. One of the prominent scholars on this point is Ali Mazrui. And Ali Mazrui has agreed that he will use the name Africa, but under protest. And so I join Ali Mazrui in using this name Africa, but precisely under protest, because the ethical issue pertaining to the naming has not yet been solved until today. Now, the legal philosophy of the conqueror is such that it recognizes by law the fact that conquest is a fact. It doesn't want to know the ethical dimensions of the issue. And so because it doesn't want to know the ethical dimensions of the issue, it has evolved a doctrine called the right of conquest. Now, this right of conquest applies equally also to Latin America and to the rest of the colonized world by the West. So, by virtue of this right of conquest, the Western colonizer was able to do a number of things. I will name 4 of them, which persist until our time. One of them was enslavement. We know the history of slavery. It is important to note that when we tour the world, it is very important that we actually go to the sites where the slaves were exited by force out of Africa to the so-called New World. I am referring to places like Ouida, places like Lagos in Africa, places like Elmina, where you can see for yourselves what it really meant. It is important in our time to remind ourselves of what has happened. And so you can understand that actually the whole problem of enslavement, forcible extraction of peoples of Africa out of this continent to the so-called New World, meant something very specific also. It meant, among other things, the depopulation of the continent of Africa. Africa suffered a loss of population. So we must understand that it is in the light of this that we should read, for example, one prominent African thinker, Sheikh Anta Diop, who argues for the rapid and the systematic repopulation of Africa. So the West is busy telling us we are making babies recklessly, when in fact, they depleted the population of the continent. You must remember that. The second point that this right of conquest actually promoted and continues to promote is actually the entrenchment of racism. The third point that the right of conquest is really busy doing is economic subjugation and exploitation. Now, the fifth item is loss of sovereign title to territory. By any reading, all the countries of Africa since political independence, there is not a single country in Africa which at the point of independence, actually also obtained economic independence. So the relationship of dependency on the former colonial masters was maintained precisely by denying Africa the economic independence. Of course, if one studies Latin America, the situation is exactly the same. For example, if one considers Galeano's book, The Open Veins of Latin America, the imagery is very important. The open veins of Latin America. You see exactly that economic subjugation and exploitation was the logic of Western colonization wherever, and it is retained until this moment as we are discussing. The fifth point is that, of course, the right of conquest became a kind of legitimation of the so-called right to name other people. That's why they named the continent Africa. Now, when it comes to South Africa, they named it also South Africa. But common sense tells us that actually South is a geographic designation. We're just talking geography. It is South, it is North, it is East, it is West. The point at issue is this. When you call this country south of the continent called Africa, are you suggesting that really what you found when you arrived in this country was simply the fauna and flora, was simply the animals that you could find, and also the organisms that live in the ocean? In other words, there were no people. Of course, I'm referring to the so-called terra nullius doctrine, which was an essential element of the doctrine of discovery. I note in parentheses that today there is a lot of talk about the Vatican having actually repudiated the doctrine of discovery. Well, a proper study of Sublimis Deus does show that this is the second and not the first repudiation. Also, it is quite problematical given the way in which Pope Francis has been doing things. First, the choice of the name Francis was by no means accidental. Why? Because Pope Francis made a choice of Francis, who is known to be the patron saint of the poor. Francis is the patron saint of the poor. And Pope Francis comes from a region where liberation theology originated. And one of the key points of departure of liberation theology is precisely preferential option for the poor. So it is no accident at all that the Pope selected this name. And true to the name, even one of his earliest encyclicals, published in 2013, namely Evangelii Gaudium, shows exactly what the Pope is thinking, wishing, and demanding for the poor. A study of this document, especially paragraphs 50 to 60, and I select paragraph 59 among them, shows very clearly that Pope Francis is deeply and fundamentally concerned about the ethical question of the poor of the world. Recently, in between, he has many others. But recently, he also has another encyclical, this time going by the name Fratelli Tutti. And you see again that Pope Francis is very serious. So my problem with the repudiation is that it is not at the same level of teaching and demand as the Pope we know. It cannot be that it is published by the dicasteries. In other words, a lower department in the Vatican hierarchy. This lower department does not speak with the same authority if it were the Pope speaking like he were to speak in an encyclical. There is a big difference between those two. And so that is a problem, especially because the first repudiation in Sublimis Deus is actually issued by a Pope, an equal of the Pope. So why is it that this time we do not find the repudiation done and expressed directly and immediately by Pope Francis himself? I don't think it is fair to characterize the Pope as having downgraded this. I don't believe it, because the way he has been doing things shows his deep and fundamental ethical concern. And so I would plead that if there is any second repudiation at all, then it must be at the level of Sublimis Deus or Fratelli Tutti or even Evangelii Gaudium. So I move then to the point that when we see this, we must understand that this very doctrine, which included the element of terra nullius, is exactly what happened, because even scholarly juridical knowledge in this country, and I want to be specific now, I am specific here to state the fact that according to one of the learned jurists who actually contributed his own article in a compendium, and this compendium was actually edited by prominent juridical scholars in this country, namely Professors Ellison Khan and Professor Hallow. The title of their book tells you the story. What is the title? The title is South Africa, the Development of its Laws and Constitution. Now they're referring to this South Africa, the development of its laws and constitution. Now you will see that one of the contributors in this book is Professor Heppel. And in his article, he does not mince his words. He is very direct and straight. He states at page 795 of this book that actually the Union of South Africa, the Union of South Africa was constructed on, and now these are his words, I'm citing his, the Union of South Africa was constructed on the right of conquest. And of course, this was conquest in an unjust war. Okay, now every constitution that succeeded that, the Union of South Africa was succeeded by the Constitution of 1961. The Constitution of 1961 did not repudiate the right of conquest, and subsequent constitutions, the Constitution of 1983, the Constitution of 1993, including the Constitution of 1996, none of them repudiated the right of conquest, which means ethically that actually Heppel is correct, even if he was speaking like a jurist, from an ethical point of view, he was correct to submit that South Africa is built upon the right of conquest. This is the fundamental point of dispute. Why? Precisely because it retains the four elements that I have mentioned already. It retains, that is why it is South Africa. Actually, it must be called from our perspective the correct name, because we know that it is now based on the right of conquest. Now it should be called Conqueror South Africa. It is not a South Africa that belongs to us. It is a South Africa that until this date belongs to the conqueror. And what did the conqueror do? Also, the conqueror committed epistemicide. And so, after 96, Ubuntu is now incorporated. When I say Ubuntu, I mean the Bantu-speaking peoples. Why do I say that? I say that because the Constitution of 1993, or 1983, I beg your pardon, 1983, actually incorporated two population groups. One is the Indian population, which came into this country in 1860. And another is white, is what by convenience, just by convenience, they are called colored people. There is no colored human being as far as I'm concerned. If you ask them a simple question, what was the original color of the colored before it was colored? What would they say? It's a way of avoiding the simple fact that, 9 months after Van Riebeeck arrived in this country, our great-great-grandmothers had children with the colonialists oppressors. So they had babies. Why not acknowledge that these are straightforward, simple human beings? And then you try to invent a category for them and you call them colored. I'm sure from Latin America, you can easily associate this with, for example, mestizos. Right. So you see, this is avoiding a simple reality that from a biological point of view, when a colonizer from France, Holland, United States, to the UK, when these colonizers meet our grannies, great-great-grannies, and they meet them sexually, they both are so human that the outcome, if everything is correct, will be a human being. So human beings have got names. Now, why don't you call them by name? And you try to, so you see the entrenchment of racism and, of course, a way of trying to avoid ethical responsibility. Why? Because of the racial undertones relating to this naming. So our grannies were already here, yet we are informed that no, you have these people called coloreds who were already part of the 1983 Constitution. The learned jurists in the camp of the conqueror referred to that 1983 Constitution as a racial federation. You see, they called it a racial federation. Why? Because they want to deny that what they call colored and what they call Indian have title to this territory. Only themselves have sovereign title to the territory by virtue of conquest in an unjust war. That we mustn't forget. So by the time they come to the 1993, 1996 Constitution, all that remains is the Bantu-speaking peoples. And then when they invite the Bantu-speaking peoples to come into the constitutional dispensation, what do? In the 1993 Constitution, at the end of the Constitution, I mean at the post-amble, from a technical point of view, legally speaking, a post-amble is just like a preamble. They are nice decorations of the Constitution, all right? Now, in the post-amble, that is where you have Ubuntu mentioned for the first time. And Ubuntu is mentioned in relation to the request, the plea for what they call reconciliation. So Ubuntu is mentioned in relation to a plea for reconciliation. Let us pause and think. Why was it not necessary to actually do the same, to achieve reconciliation with the colored and the Indian in 1983? Why was reconciliation not a feature in the 1983 Constitution? But it becomes an important feature only in the 93 Constitution, which was in fact a transition constitution to the 1996 Constitution. By the time we arrive at the 1996 Constitution, a big miracle happens. For many people, the transition to 1994 was a miracle. People call, oh, a miracle in South Africa. Really thinks it's miraculous. Well, a miracle, theologically speaking, is something very difficult. Nevertheless, I want to say this, that the miracle is this, that all the people who were part and parcel of the negotiations, when they saw the Constitution of 1996, as far as I know, not a single one of them raised the objection that Ubuntu is completely absent. Read the Constitution of 1996 yourself, from the first to the last page. You will never see Ubuntu there. Is it so that all the people who negotiated for the new dispensation really forgot that in the Constitution of 1993, Ubuntu was present? Did they all forget this? Why was there not even a single one, just one, who asked, hey, and where is Ubuntu in the 1996 Constitution? Why were they all satisfied that it is completely absent? You know, in psychology, we know about collective guilt, for example, as espoused by Karl Jaspers. There's such a thing as collective guilt. Now, I am yet to be informed about a new concept in psychology called collective amnesia, because it is strange that everybody forgot. Well, if you lift the lid of strangeness, you will see that, no, it is understandable that everyone forgot, because the people who gained victory, those who won, so that South Africa remains South Africa and not, the name remains South Africa and not Conqueror South Africa. Those are the ones who won. And who are they? The ones who won are actually those that Professor Samti Terblanche calls the MEC, the Mineral and Energy Complex. These are the people who won, the Anglo-American. We must not forget that there is a deep-seated international dimension of the struggle in this country, it is intertwined with international politics. And so we must not be surprised when Professor Sam Peter Branch tells us, no, the real winners is Anglo-American. And so what does it mean? It means the continuation of economic subjugation and exploitation. If anyone doubts this, let me give you one example. Way back, not so long ago, there was a Marikana issue. The miners there were demanding on strike. They were demanding that, please, 5,000 per month does not make sense at all. We want minimum 12,500 rand. Of course, they were denied. It was told that such money is unavailable. They cannot have the money at all. And there were consequences for that. It is very interesting to find that Piketty, in his book, Capital in the 20th Century, in the very first chapter, he refers to Marikana. Well, I want to tell you something more about Marikana, that while they were refusing to give the miners 12,500 per month, the salary of the CEO at that time was 12,500 per hour. Per hour. So he gets that per hour. He refuses to share. Per hour, 12,500. And I'm asking you to pay me per month what you earn in 1 month. You say no. Do you think the story ended then? No. Recently, a colleague also sent me some statistics. And what did we find? We found that in the mining industries right now, one who earns, there were 6 of them, and the highest earner gets, now this is more than 10 years after Marikana, the highest earner gets 750,000 rand per day, and the lowest 250,000 per day. So what does it mean to talk the language of poverty, to talk the language of development, when we see very clearly what actually happens? Now, I'd like to connect this to the so-called 2008 World Economic Crisis. Most of us are familiar with the details. I just want to point at something which is quite recent, and that is from the text of Professor Chomsky and his colleague. What are they saying? Well, the two professors do mention quite explicitly that the bailout for the banks was a lot of money, 29 trillion. And the bulk of the money was actually directed. Once it was released, the main beneficiaries were the banks themselves. Now, they didn't stop there. They wanted to check. They said, but you know, the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, estimates that we need about 30 to 60,000 to $60 billion per year to feed everybody on this planet, to feed with nutritious, health-giving food. It's not just feeding, you feed with nutritious, health-giving food. And so they estimated by calculation that actually, if that money, which was the bailout, was spent according to this estimation of the World Food and Agriculture Organization, then everybody here on this planet would have been fed for the next 500 years. So when you talk development, when you talk all this, what are you saying? Now you can see why Ubuntu is out of the Constitution of 1996, because Ubuntu is in ethical resistance and objection to this situation. Ubuntu says, no, this situation is unethical, it is untenable, it ought to change, it must change. Now, if you put it in a constitution which speaks a different language, then of course there is a clash, an ethical clash. There's no clash of ideology, just an ethical clash. One sees what it means to say Ubuntu. Of course, I asked you to put the word Ubuntu in with a hyphen. Why did I say so? Because I wanted you to understand two things. One is that so that when it is hyphenated, it refers to Ubuntu as a philosophical concept. When it is without a hyphen, it refers to Ubuntu as everyday practice. The two are married together, but just to make the distinction, because it is an important distinction, it is necessary to indicate that distinction by writing Ubu-ntu, okay? And a detailed discussion of that you will find in my book in chapter 3. The strictures of time do not allow me to go really deeply into that, except to make the following few points. One is that you can never have Ubuntu at all if you do not have Umuntu. You need a human being who will speak and act the language of Ubuntu. So Ubuntu then becomes an ethical concept born out of a specific epistemology. So there is an ethical dimension to this concept. There is an epistemological dimension to this concept. Second point I want to make about this is that exactly Ubuntu is the acknowledgement, a philosophical acknowledgement that motion is the principle of being. Please note, motion is the principle of being. And even being in that case must be written as B-E-hyphen-I-N-G. We must remember that even English must be taught philosophy. Heidegger taught German philosophy by inventing philosophical terms which were not available in German. So philosophy can be English, any language can be taught philosophy. In this case, when we talk Ubuntu and say motion is the principle of being, we mean exactly that. What is the effect of this understanding? The effect of this understanding is that Ubuntu will speak the language of ness. The suffix is N-E-S. It is not I-S-E-M, because an ism like communism, capitalism is already dogmatic by character, whereas Ubuntu is resistant to dogma. And so on that basis, you have certain principles enunciated, ethical principles. Because of the strictures of time, I'm going to highlight only two. One of them is that ufite khomo, utshware motho. Now, there is actually in the province of Limpopo a village known by that name, Feta Khomo, Utshware motho. So it is no accident. If you go there, like I did go with some colleagues for some research, if you visit that village, which is normally the village of Mushaleji, If you visit the village and you ask the elders, why is it that it is called Fetakom, you will understand very clearly that it means something that capitalism does not mean. It means human well-being first, and the rest will follow. Now, capitalism says profit first, and everything will follow. In the book that I mentioned by Professor Chomsky, they used a provocative expression to describe capitalism, profit über alles. Now, the über alles dimension, which is provocative for obvious historical reasons, okay? But the point is that Ubuntu is not saying über alles, wealth and money. Wealth and money come afterwards. Human well-being is the first. So it is promote life and avoid killing. The second one, which is directly related to that, is the following. And it is, if I translate this literally, what will you hear? It's the children of the same family share the head of a low caste. Now, if you look at the low caste, you will see why the wisdom of our elders chose actually the head and not the body of the low caste. The body of the low caste is big, but the head is tiny and small. Now, sharing is more meaningful when you actually have little yourself. Don't wait until you have too much. Because if you have too much, you are throwing away, you are not sharing. So make sure that when you, in the little that you have, show your care and concern for the other. And from Ubuntu philosophical perspective, even from biological anthropology, it is beyond doubt that we humans on this planet belong to one family. We humans on this planet belong to one family. Apart from biological, anthropological findings, again, I urge people to go visit, for example, the National Museum of Ethiopia in Addis Ababa.
Yes.
We visit Kenya. There you will see, there can be very educative tourism in Africa if we care to tour Africa seriously with the intention to learn about us as human beings and to learn about human relations, okay? So we find that apart from those, we have now from the scientific study of DNA. You remember that a few years ago, there was a genome project, and the genome project worldwide suggested, the chair of that project actually wrote a book, and the book is called The Language of God. Now, in that book, Collins tells us very directly, and I now want to cite his own words, that actually it doesn't matter from which part of the world you come from. Genetically, human beings, the DNA of all of us, we are 99.9% identical. I'm sure Collins knows English. He knows the difference between similar and identical. So he did not make a mistake when he chose the word identical. 99.9% identical. And then to show that he understood this word, the next sentence is clear. We are similar. We belong to the same human family. So, All these divisions are seriously artificial.
Yeah, Professor Ramose, I think it's been really
And
so
Ubuntu
interesting
is
listening.
arguing precisely against this.
Mm.
Yeah, Ubuntu is arguing exactly against these artificialities. The next part of it, if you speak any of our languages, for example, if we say help one another, what will be the suffix? Yatusana. If you speak isiZulu or isiXhosa, ukusizana, always ana at the end, doing it always together for mutual benefit and mutual advancement. Why? Because doing it together is actually agreeing with the ethical principle that you promote life and avoid killing. I'm sure I can go on for too long, but I think up to this point, I have laid the ground for us to engage in some discussion. And then you will see that when we engage in discussion, this very framework is actually the problem in the country called South Africa, which I prefer to call Conqueror South Africa. One last point is that, according to the history, and for me, history is his story. History is his story because it is not her story. It is yet to become our story. So, in other words, even the objectivity that is claimed and espoused by history is questionable. Now, I want to illustrate this point by reference to one community in this country, the Khoi and the San peoples. Now, I've referred to Lucy. Now, according to the historiography of the conqueror, there is yet another miracle in this country. What is the miracle? That only the Khoisan peoples grew like grass out of this country. Only them. How can any human being grow like grass sprouting in the field? That cannot be true. If you follow the history of Mapungubwe, which has long been suppressed, especially by the University of Pretoria, the Department of Anthropology, you will see that these peoples were already part and parcel of the communities of Mapungubwe Empire. So, history is always his story. And the fact that we originate as Homo sapiens at a conventionally acknowledged site in Africa, why do you now say, no, these ones don't belong to that? By what scientific means do you come to that decision? So historiography is not particularly always true. And in this case, we take exception because they want now to describe only these people as indigenous. But you see, if you study the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, what do you find? I don't want to go a long time. I want to just to make you understand one thing. It is a diplomatic document. And because of its diplomatic character, what does it do? In fact, it acknowledges everything. It even uses the word colonization. It acknowledges the injuries of colonization. It acknowledges, but all this is in the considerance, not in the articles of the declaration. It also acknowledges the sovereign title to territory and that it was lost and that it must be recovered. All these are acknowledged. But when you get into the articles, especially Article 31, you see very clearly that there is a problem here. At the considerance, the reasoning is at the horizontal level. What do I mean by horizontal level? I mean by horizontal level that we are all equal as human beings. But when you come to the articles, there is vertical reasoning. Why? Because states which are undefined, deliberately so, states which are undefined are actually at the top of the hierarchy, and the indigenous peoples are below, which means they are under permanent tutelage, exactly from those who colonized them in the past. So it is a repetition of the right of conquest. So the declaration is a repetition of the right of conquest and nothing more. So seen from that perspective, it really does not stand as a defender of the right of the indigenous peoples, precisely because even the historical and ethical description of indigenous is questionable. I want to stop here and give us the time to discuss further. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for those comments. We really learned a lot. I think it's been really interesting listening to how Ubuntu had the place it's had in history, how it goes through having presence in the Constitution for a short time and then not, how it's incompatible with the idea of conquest and many other ideas. So I think it's also really interesting when you mention that to share, you have to have little, because in Chile, we have a saint, very important for us, Padre Hurtado, who also was famous for saying, give until it hurts. That's what God also wants us to do. So I think it's really interesting to listen to this, and especially the most important takeaway that I have is what you mentioned from the very beginning, that we're all one humanity. We're all one type of human being with, of course, 99% identical DNA. So I think that's so important to remember all the time. And I did have a couple of questions for you. For example, when you mentioned that Ubuntu as a philosophical idea, it's important that it's hyphenated.
Yeah. No,
when you mention it all together, it's a more popular element of the modern day language. How did that transition take place? What difference does it make if we talk about Ubuntu as a philosophical idea versus Ubuntu as a modern day topic?
Well, in fact, there is one thing we should also acknowledge, that those who are the successors in title to conquest in an unjust war are seriously interested in preserving the status quo. And because they are interested in preserving the status quo, they check and study the means by which they can do so. One of their biggest advantages is that they have economic power to do so. So what would they do? They would want to promote an idea of Ubuntu, which is unrelated to actually Ubuntu as known and practiced by the indigenous peoples. In other words, they want to adulterate that. So the adulteration of Ubuntu becomes its propagation, so that people really don't understand what really it means. I mean, you can check, for example, this a book of Ngomani. She happens to be the granddaughter of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And if you check, it's nice, it's simple, and it tells you what it is in practice, but not really what you should understand deeply about it. Okay? So people just take it precisely at that level.
Right.
There is no.
Yeah, I know that if you check podcast Ubuntu, you can see a myriad of different topics: Ubuntu for business, Ubuntu for any kind of topic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
you
so
see.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, but who controls the media? Exactly those who have the economic power. So they will tell you Ubuntu is forgiveness, as if history has never had forgiveness before Ubuntu. You get the point? So it is a trivialization of Ubuntu in a way that actually serves the interests of those in power. And luckily, it is not the case that all of us go together with that. We are aware of what is happening, and that is the reason we challenge it.
And for when we talk about, just for our listeners who might not be so familiar with the term, when you mention it in a hyphenated way as a philosophy, what would you say it actually means in the deep sense?
In the deep sense, it means first what I have said. You see, I hyphenate it because normally people would write it as one word. But if you are a native speaker, you soon recognize that actually this one word consists of two parts. One part is Ubu, and the other part is Ntu. Okay? Now, this Ubu, from a philosophical point of view, is simply standing for Ubu. You can put, if you don't like to put Ubuntu, for example, you can log it in. Let me use the language of communications technology. You can log on to Ubu. You can log on to Ubu-ntu, and then it would be Ubu-ntu. Now, Ubu-ntu means pain. Now, if you don't like to Ubu-ntu, you don't want to log into that, you can remove Ubu-ntu and still keep Ubu. And then you would log something onto it, like Ubutagati. Now, that would mean witchcraft. So you see, what does that mean? It means Ubu is like a dangling participle, ontologically speaking. It is like a dangling participle waiting for the main sentence. And the main sentence is what you log onto it. Now, when you log onto it, it ceases to be general, okay? Now, I have used the word dangling to show that Ubu speaks to the principle or the idea, if you like. It speaks to the idea that motion is the principle of being, okay? So when you log it onto it, being does not cease to be in motion. Even that Ntu is in motion. That is why I would say, when you have Ubuntu, you don't have actually an ism, you have a ness, because the suffix ness shows that this is, now I use a term that I use in the book, namely reo motic. Reos, reos, motion, right? The Greek word. So it is reo motic. Now, if it is always in motion, it means it is open to change and changeability, and it changes itself. But for all that to happen, you need a human being, like you need in the philosophy of Heidegger, you would need Dasein, okay? Now here you would need Umuntu. Now even Umu, from a logical point of view, it behaves in exactly the same way like Ubu, as I mentioned. You see, because I said you log onto it, Ubu, you can log onto it so many, and it will give different meanings. Umu is the same. Umu is a dangling participle until you log ntu onto it, and it becomes Umuntu. Now you see, you log the same item is what you log onto with regard to Ubu and Umu, and that is Ntu, and that relates not to humanism, as so many people misinterpret and misunderstand Ubuntu. It is humanness. You get the point? Being in the state of being a human being. Now, you are just ontologically speaking like that. When do you become ethically like that? When you exercise humaneness. Can you see the difference? Humaneness goes together with humanness. So there is a difference. You see, so I see that when some writers who try to interpret me somehow make this mistake, that they don't make this distinction clear. They confuse issues there. You may not confuse, because the one is the ethical dimension, the other is the ontological dimension. You see, and then in the ontological context, that's exactly where you gain the epistemology that now enables you to think ethically about being a human being in the world. Okay, now this is the philosophical import in short. I go a long way in the text to explain and to show why writers like Samkange, he wrote a book called Ubuntuism. So I challenge the ism because the reasoning is what I'm saying. But the language, he somehow did not teach English African philosophy. That was the point. He just used English as if it was enough by itself to explain African philosophy, and that was not so. We can say the same, for example, with regard to Kenneth Kaunda. He uses the concept humanism, Kwame Nkrumah, but when you follow their reasoning, you actually see humanness and humaneness. But they didn't use these concepts. They used English instead of African philosophy.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Thank you so much for all that. I have to say, it's been really a delight talking with you today. And thanks so much for shedding light on this topic of Ubuntu, which you now know is humaneness at the very core. And this can definitely help us learn a lot more about ourselves and our inherent interconnectedness with everyone around us. So thank you so much, Professor Ramose. It's been a pleasure and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks very much, much appreciated. And yes, everybody present, I extend my thanks to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Right.